Good evening, and welcome to another quiet drift through the forgotten corners of history. Tonight, we'll be descending slowly into the murky, candlelit passageways of medieval medicine, where fear, superstition, and desperation converged in the face of one of the most devastating pandemics in human memory, the Black Death. But this is not a tale of dramatic tragedy or grim chaos. This is a gentle unfolding of strange beliefs and curious practices, observed through the slow-moving lens of time. You're invited to lean back, rest your eyes, and let your mind settle as we explore a peculiar notion that emerged in certain corners of the medieval world, that human intimacy, even the most private kind, might somehow protect the body from the plague. Of course, this belief was not widely accepted by all. In fact, it sat at the margins of medicine and morality, sometimes encouraged in hushed whispers, sometimes punished with fervor. And yet, it lingered intertwined with alchemical texts, monastic prohibitions, and the fragrant perfumes of brothel halls. So, let us begin, not with the headlines of plague years or the charts of mortality, but with a quiet step into everyday life, a world of narrow streets and flickering lamps, where the scent of thyme and vinegar mixed with more earthly smells, and where people did what they could to survive, sometimes even seeking salvation in the arms of another. A soft immersion into the rhythm of ordinary existence during a time of extraordinary fear. Imagine yourself walking along the cobbled streets of a 14th century European town, your steps muffled by the damp chill of an early spring morning. The mist hangs low, softening the sharp outlines of stone buildings. Above, smoke spirals lazily from crooked chimneys, and down below, shutters creak open slowly to greet another day. This was not a time defined entirely by chaos. Despite the looming shadow of the Black Death, ordinary, often monotonous life persisted. Bakers still woke before dawn to knead coarse flour into heavy loaves. Merchants stacked bundles of cloth or measured spices with practiced ease. Children skipped stones in the mud, and old women swept their doorsteps, muttering prayers beneath their breath. Plague was not a constant presence, though it haunted the edges of daily thought. Instead, it came in waves, intermittent and cruel. Between outbreaks, the rhythms of village and town resumed with cautious hope. Fairs reopened. Alehouses filled again with quiet laughter. Midwives attended births, and woodcarvers shaped small toys for newly born infants. Inside the homes of the common folk, you might find rushes scattered on the floor, changed only infrequently. Their scent mixed with herbs like lavender or sage, not for comfort alone but as a ward against the invisible. People believed the air itself could be dangerous thick with what they called miasma, or bad vapors. So they burned juniper and carried pomanders, small metal balls filled with scented paste. Food was simple but filling when available. Thick pottages of barley and root vegetables, salted meats in winter months, cheese wrapped in cloth and stored in cool cellars. There was no refrigeration, of course, just the clever use of smoke, salt, and shade, and always the breadants, dark, and the heart of every meal. Water was rarely trusted. Ale and weak wine were more commonly consumed, but even these were not always clean. Illness was constant, in ways both seen and unseen. Coughs and fever came and went like the seasons, and the spectre of plague loomed larger, with each tale passed between travellers and traders. In such a world, fear took on a quiet familiarity. It lived in the cautious glance, the hurried step past the home of a coughing neighbour, yet it was also strangely ordinary. The dead were mourned, yes, but in many towns, death had long been a part of the cycle of life. What made the plague different was not just its speed, but its mystery. And where mystery blooms, so too do strange beliefs. It was said by some that laughter and good cheer might ward off the illness, that a joyful heart made strong the body's defences. In this spirit, there were those who believed that sensual pleasure sex, in particular, could be a sort of medicine, a way to warm the blood, lift the spirits, and drive out the bad humours. After all, was not pleasure the opposite of decay? This belief, while never dominant, existed quietly beneath the more accepted theories of humoral imbalance and corrupted air. It surfaced in certain alchemical texts and folk remedies. Whispers passed among companions in taverns, or scribbled in the margins of medical treatises, and in a time when no one truly knew what caused the plague, even the strangest cures were sometimes given weight. As we drift from these simple scenes of daily labor and quiet meals, we carry with us this seed of thought or belief that intimacy, in its most human form, might push back the darkness. In the next segment, we will explore how some individuals acted upon this notion, how their lives were shaped not by healing, but by hope. As the plague tightened its grip on Europe, sweeping from the coasts inward with devastating precision, people from all walks of life looked not just to priests and doctors, but to less conventional sources of comfort, and perhaps healing. In the dimly lit corners of certain towns, amid the layered perfumes of rosewater and cloves, there lived a class of women who occupied a paradoxical place in society. Courtesans, sometimes revered, more often reviled, were believed by a small but curious few to hold a kind of secret power not through magic or medicine, but through the physical act of intimacy. Imagine a house of such women, situated on a winding canal in Venice or nestled beside the quieter roads of Avignon. The shutters drawn, the lamps lit low. Inside, laughter flickers like candlelight. Some of the men who visited did so not merely for pleasure, but in the quiet hope that the warmth of the body might fend off the cold fingers of disease, that in shared breath they might somehow escape the choking air beyond the door. The idea may sound peculiar to modern ears, but in a world with little understanding of infection, many clung to what they could feel and see. The act of sex was thought, by a few early thinkers, to stir the humours into balance, to purge the melancholia that darkened the soul and corrupted the blood. For some, this belief was simply an excuse. For others, it was a prescription. A small number of medieval physicians, usually outside the mainstream, mentioned this theory with caution. In 1350, an anonymous French physician wrote a curious line in the margin of a broader treatise on disease. It translates roughly as, "The flame of union kindles life, and where life is strong, pestilence may find no hold." It was never accepted by the universities of Paris or Padua, but the sentiment drifted along back channels of medical thought. It is important to understand the climate of the time. Mainstream medical wisdom focused on the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, whose imbalances were believed to invite sickness. Treatments included bloodletting, purgatives, and changes in diet. Yet where official medicine failed, people turned to the folk traditions that surrounded them. In parts of Germany, for example, an old wives' tale advised newlywed couples to lie close together each night during plague season. The warmth of their joined bodies, it was said, would draw the sickness from the air around them and ground it safely into the earth. There's little evidence such beliefs were widespread, but they existed quietly, consistently in pockets of the continent. Meanwhile, others responded with fury to the idea that sex might heal. In many cities, when outbreaks intensified, brothels were shuttered or even burned. Prostitutes were blamed for spreading plague wrongly, but predictably. Yet in times of calm between waves, those same women were sometimes quietly sought out again, not just by the desperate, but by the curious and the fearful. The contradiction is striking. In Siena, records note a strange brief period during the late 1340s, when the city levied fines on those seen consorting excessively, yet also permitted a special tax to keep certain brothels open during an outbreak. It was, perhaps, an acknowledgement of a quiet truth, that even in fear, people long for contact. One of the more curious cases comes from London, where in 1362, a mid-level merchant, named Thomas Belling, was brought before a city magistrate for promoting lewd engagements under the promise of medical safety. He had, it seems, begun charging anxious townsmen for access to a woman he claimed was blessed with a plague-proof spirit. The claim was, of course, unfounded, and Belling was fined heavily. But the incident reveals how this belief, while fringe, had enough traction to lead some to exploit it. And then there were the religious monks and clergy, who vehemently condemned such practices. Sermons thundered against indulgence, linking plague not with the lack of intimacy, but with the excess of it. Sex was, in their eyes, a spiritual vulnerability, something that called down the wrath of heaven. But even among these voices, there were quiet admissions that isolation bred sorrow, and sorrow bred sickness. In some monasteries, physical closeness was allowed in small measure, shared meals, shared beds in extreme cold, not for pleasure, but for preservation. The line was fine and carefully observed, but it existed. In all of this, we see not only a curious belief, but a human pattern. When gripped by fear, people reach toward warmth, toward connection. Whether it be through love, comfort, or superstition, the body becomes both shield and sanctuary. And as we leave behind these quiet rooms and shadowed alleys, our path leads toward a deeper understanding of how such beliefs took root not merely through desire, but through the slow whisper of culture, carried across parchment and spoken over candle-lit meals. Next, we will turn to the artifacts and mysteries left behind, scraps of forgotten knowledge, inscriptions half-worn with time, and the tantalizing remains of a world that tried desperately to make sense of suffering. As we gently turn the pages of time, away from the bustling homes and brothels of medieval cities, we find ourselves surrounded by stillness. Now we are beneath the ground, amid the damp silence of burial layers and the forgotten debris of lives once lived. Here, in the careful hands of archaeologists and conservators, emerge whispers from the past, objects and writings that hint, ever so faintly, at the peculiar belief that physical pleasure could ward off death. One such fragment comes from the charred ruins of a physician's study in northern Italy. In the early 2000s, excavations uncovered a scorched manuscript buried beneath layers of soot and collapsed timber, likely the result of a 14th century fire. Though much of the text was lost, the remaining lines speak, curiously, of pleasurable engagements to stir the humours into harmony, and suggest that such acts be taken with the guidance of Venus, when Saturn is dulled. The language is poetic, vague, and alchemical, but it suggests that some among the medical community were exploring unorthodox paths to balance and health. Not far from these findings, another site yielded a delicate bronze amulet in the shape of a woman's figure, etched faintly with Latin script. It translates to something akin to, "Let warmth preserve." Scholars debate whether it was a charm, a token of affection, or a protective talisman, perhaps. A bit of all three. Such objects would have been carried close to the body, secreted away in a purse or tied to a belt, worn beneath layers of wool and linen. And then there is the matter of the so-called Venus tablets of Lübeck. These small, crudely carved wooden slats, discovered during urban renovations in the old Hanseatic port town, contain a mixture of medicinal instructions and erotic aphorisms. One reads, "The body in delight sings away the rotting air." Another, more clinical, details a regimen involving the joining of bodies for 3 nights' duration, with aromatic herbs burned thereafter. While some dismiss these as the scribbles of folk healers, others see in them a remnant of a cultural undercurrent, faint but genuine belief in the healing properties of pleasure. It is important to tread carefully here. Archaeology rarely offers definitive proof of belief systems, especially those that dwell in the realm of the intimate and the unspoken, but material culture gives us clues. A rise in the number of bathhouse-related items, wooden combs, scented oils, ornamental pins found in towns during plague years, may suggest a turn toward bodily treatments, even indulgences, in the absence of effective cures. The bathhouses themselves are intriguing. These were places of cleansing, yes, but also of social contact and sometimes more. In cities like Prague and Cologne, bathhouses remained open longer than other public spaces during plague times, perhaps indicating that some viewed them not as dangerous, but as protective. Steam, warmth, closeness, these, too, were believed by some to be medicinal. Among the stranger finds is a burial near Bruges, in which a man was interred not with religious icons or tools of trade, but with a pouch of perfumed cloth, a small wooden figurine of a reclining woman, and a roll of pressed lavender. The grave dated to a known plague year. The purpose of these items remains unknown, perhaps tokens of love, or maybe ritualistic tools, meant to accompany him beyond. Further east, in what is now Hungary, a monastery's library held a set of marginalia notes in the borders of larger theological works. One such note, scribbled in faded iron gall ink, reads simply, "As joy lifts the heart, so may it lift the breath." Whether this referred to music, companionship, or something more carnal, we cannot say. But the sentiment, once again, reflects a recurring idea, that connection could be medicine. These quiet remnants, manuscripts, objects, symbols form a subtle tapestry. No single piece tells a full story, but taken together, they offer a glimpse into how some in the medieval world responded not only to death, but to the loneliness it brought. In the face of an unknowable illness, even the private became political, philosophical, and occasionally medicinal. As we step back into the surface world, Let us carry with us the echoes of these fragments, not sensational, but human. In the next chapter, we shall look at how different social classes experienced these beliefs, how the intimate and the elite lived side by side, often with sharply different understandings of the same mysterious plague. Now we return to the surface, back to stone halls and straw-thatched huts, winding staircases and wide town squares. But this time, we observe more closely the delicate boundaries between social worlds. For while the plague touched all levels of society, the beliefs and behaviors surrounding it, especially those related to the body, to pleasure, and to medicine, were deeply shaped by class. Among the elite, responses to the plague often carried an air of ritual and formality. In grand homes and country manors, nobles retreated from towns at the first sign of illness. They followed the guidance of court physicians, who emphasized balance, order, and purification. These physicians rarely spoke of sensuality as remedy. They relied instead on prescribed diets, music, fragrance, and bloodletting. Yet in private, the story may have been more complex. In Florence, the physician and writer Giovanni Boccaccio wrote not only of death and despair, but of a group of young nobles who withdrew to a countryside villa during the height of the Black Death. There, according to his Decameron, they entertained each other with tales, laughter, food, and though delicately described acts of affection, the idea was not to indulge for indulgence's sake, but to preserve health through joy, to maintain the strength of the soul. Whether or not the story reflects actual events, it hints at a belief that pleasure could be curative and not just for the body, but for the spirit. In contrast, the lives of commoners were shaped more by immediacy than philosophy. Labourers, herdsmen, weavers, and their families rarely had the luxury of retreat. They remained in cities, in villages, exposed to the air and to one another. Here, ideas about the plague were passed in whispers, shaped by folk tradition and local healers. In poorer quarters, herbalists and wise women played a central role. These figures often straddled the line between healer and spiritual guide. Some advised that couples lie close in the evening, especially during cold nights, to preserve warmth and strengthen the lungs. Others recommended the burning of love tokens, ribbons, poems, small wooden charms believed to draw away sickness. Some even suggested moderate sensual contact, under the right astrological conditions, as a means to quicken the blood and chase away the mists. Of course, these beliefs were not uniform. In many places, sexual contact was feared as a source of contagion, and yet, the fear was unevenly applied. Among the elite, intimate liaisons were more likely to be concealed, framed as private diversions or necessary duties of marriage. Among the poor, such actions, especially those that took place outside the bounds of formal wedlock, were more easily condemned, sometimes punished. In cities such as Paris or London, laws emerged that sought to regulate sexual activity during plague years. These edicts often fell more harshly upon the lower classes. Brothels were shuttered first in poor districts, while high-born patrons were rarely named or charged. This imbalance reveals more than legal disparity, it reveals how differently the same beliefs could be treated based on who held them. In one recorded instance from Cologne, a tailor's apprentice was accused of reckless engagement with a laundress during a time of plague. His defense? He believed that their union would warm his blood and protect his lungs. The court dismissed the claim, but the record preserved his words shaped, perhaps, by fragments of folk wisdom passed down in workshops and alleys. Compare this with a letter from a minor noble in Provence, who wrote to his brother during an outbreak in 1371. "I take care to keep cheerful company in the evenings. My physician assures me that joy, light laughter, and small comforts of the flesh are of more use than a dozen draughts of bitter tonic. There is no sense of shame, no legal rebuke, just quiet indulgence, wrapped in learned language." This contrast was not only in perception, but in consequence. The poor often lived many to a room, while the wealthy might retreat behind thick walls and private gardens. If intimacy was used as comfort, it played out very differently across these divides. For some, it was a whispered remedy. For others, a private pastime. And yet, beneath the difference in setting, the desire was the same, a yearning for warmth, for reassurance, for the illusion, however brief, that one might be safe from the cold breath of disease. As we gently close this segment, we begin to see how the idea of sensuality, as cure though rare and ridiculed in official channels, found expression in subtle ways, shaped by where one stood in society, by what one could afford, and by who was watching. In our next chapter, we shall explore the ecclesiastical and moral reactions to such beliefs. How did the church respond to this quiet rebellion of the body? And what did spiritual authorities make of the notion that physical touch might heal the soul? As we move softly from manors and markets to cloisters and cathedrals, the tone of our story changes. Here, beneath vaulted ceilings and beside cold stone altars, the air is heavy with incense and restraint. The church, both a spiritual refuge and a powerful institution, held enormous sway over how people understood the plague and how they responded to its terrors. Official doctrine was clear. The plague was a punishment from God, a consequence of sin, both personal and collective. To survive, one must repent, fast, pray, and abstain from worldly pleasures. Any deviation from this path was not merely folly, it was heresy, even rebellion. And yet, in quiet corners, a strange tension grew, because while the church preached denial of the flesh, the people continued to live in it. Sermons throughout Europe, preserved in fragments and full manuscripts, denounce carnal indulgence during plague time. A Dominican preacher in Flanders, around 1360, warned his congregation that those who seek the warmth of the bed over the light of prayer will not find comfort in this world or the next. His words echoed across pulpits from Paris to Prague. The clergy were vigilant, especially during outbreaks. In some regions, couples were discouraged from marrying until the plague had passed. Confession booths filled not only with fear, but with whispered guilt of touching, of longing, of breaking the fast in more ways than one. And yet, the church's hold was never absolute. In monasteries and convents, life was often highly regulated. Chastity, silence, and fasting formed the pillars of discipline. But even here, human nature lingered. Letters from abbots to bishops occasionally mention restlessness among the younger brothers, or the need for stricter supervision during long nights. Such phrases are cryptic, yet telling. Outside the cloister, in the bustling parishes and town churches, priests walked among their flock. They heard the fears of the sick, the last confessions of the dying. They saw the contradictions, the man who wept during confession but still visited the bathhouse, the woman who prayed earnestly, yet returned each night to her lover's home. Some priests began to quietly soften their stance. They spoke of comfort, not indulgence, of human need, not depravity. A few even counselled moderation over abstinence, suggesting that the maintenance of the soul did not demand total rejection of the body's warmth. In the records of a small parish near Bordeaux, we find the unusual testimony of a friar named Mathieu, who wrote, "I do not condone the flesh, but neither do I condemn it when it seeks warmth from the cold terror of death. Let us show mercy where judgment only deepens the wound." His letter, though rare, offers a glimpse into the gentler undercurrent within the church's towering walls. Nonetheless, there were limits. Public displays of affection, especially those between the unmarried, were increasingly frowned upon during times of plague. In Florence, city watchmen were instructed to break up any such behaviour, lest it provoke divine wrath. In London, kissing in public during a plague year was briefly made a finable offence. But private behaviour was harder to control. In villages, where the priest visited only once a week, beliefs mingled freely with folk customs. A woman might still hang herbs above her marital bed to draw joy to the body. A husband might still believe that closeness to his wife would stir his blood and protect his lungs. And always, the line was thin. One bishop in Bohemia expressed concern that a growing number of his flock were confusing the embrace of comfort with the embrace of lust, yet he offered no solutions, only prayers. The church, in many ways, was navigating its own paradox. It wished to offer solace, but demanded austerity. It spoke of divine love, yet feared human affection. And during the plague, when fear gnawed at every soul, people sometimes turned to the closest source of warmth they could find, another person. In this, the church saw both danger and truth, for while it feared the body's power, it also understood its pull. And in time, it would begin to emphasize charity, compassion, and community, not just abstinence. As we close this segment, The echo of bells fades behind us, and we return once more to the broader landscape of belief. In our next chapter, we'll turn our gaze to the physicians and scholars of the time, not those who dabbled in forbidden remedies, but those who attempted to make sense of it all, balancing theory, observation, and sometimes contradiction. Let us now walk slowly through the stone corridors of medieval universities and infirmaries, where robes whisper against the floors, and the scent of ink mingles with the faint smell of dried herbs and old vellum. This is the world of physicians, apothecaries, and natural philosophers, those who sought to impose order on a world unravelling at the seams. Among the learned, the plague posed a unique challenge. It defied observation, logic, and precedent. Treatments failed, theories fractured, and so, within their quiet study halls, scholars debated and revised their understanding of the human body and, sometimes, its more private functions. The dominant medical framework of the time was still based on the humoral theory inherited from ancient Greece and Rome. Health was a matter of balance between the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness, including the plague, was believed to arise from imbalance brought on by corrupted air, bad food, poor temperament, or unfortunate alignment of the stars. Most physicians advised abstinence from strenuous activity, including sexual relations, during plague outbreaks. The act was thought to weaken the body by depleting the vital spirits, especially in men. Better to preserve one's inner fire, wrote Gentile de Foligno, a respected 14th century Italian physician, than to extinguish it in the pursuit of ephemeral pleasure. And yet, some voices disagreed quietly, and with caution. There were those, particularly among the more empirically minded, who noticed that not all who indulged in sensual pleasures during plague time perished. These observations, difficult to quantify and sensitive in nature, began to appear in marginalia and second-hand reports. A lesser-known physician from the Rhineland, Master Ulrich von Pappenheim, kept a private notebook not intended for public eyes in which he recorded various responses to the plague. One entry reads, "A certain man, widowed thrice and twice a father, claimed that his nightly union with his servant brought him sleep, and in sleep, relief. He did not sicken, even as 3 homes fell." Ulrich does not endorse the behaviour, he merely notes it. But this pattern clinical detachment toward private acts appears in other writings from the period as well. Physicians, bound by decorum, often refrained from discussing sensuality as medicine directly, but their observations hint at an openness to the idea, at least as one possibility among many. In Iberia, Arabic medical texts still influential in parts of the peninsula occasionally referred to pleasure therapies, meant to restore emotional and physical vitality. These were not necessarily sexual in nature, but the boundaries were blurred. The Andalusian scholar Ibn al-Khatib, who famously died of the plague himself, wrote extensively about contagion and cleanliness. In passing, he remarked that, where laughter, music, and warmth are present, the soul resists corruption longer. One wonders how far that warmth extended. At the universities of Montpellier and Bologna, medical treatises during the later 14th century began to allow for more holistic approaches to healing. Rest, companionship, and moderate indulgence were sometimes prescribed, not always publicly, but in certain private consultations. A gentle massage, a warm bath shared with a trusted companion, even a glass of wine and a lover's embrace, these were framed not as indulgences, but as stabilizing forces. And yet, a note of caution remained. Too much sensual pleasure, it was said, would thin the blood, weaken the organs, and open the body to disease. The ideal was balance, temperance, that elusive point where the humours were neither inflamed by desire nor cooled by sorrow. Even in hospitals, where the dying gathered in numbers too great to count, some physicians observed curious rituals: a touch of perfume on the wrist, a hand clasped gently by a nurse, not for examination, but for comfort, a bowl of spiced wine left by a patient's cot. These small acts, sensual in their own quiet way, were not cures, but they were, perhaps, something else, anchors for the soul adrift. In the end, the medical community never formally accepted the idea that sex could cure the plague. It lacked theoretical grounding and, to many, felt too close to superstition. But in practice, belief is rarely bound by theory alone. The lived experiences of patients, the private writings of physicians, and the whispered testimonies of survivors all point to a world where the body was not just a site of disease, but also of comfort. And as we prepare to leave these hushed libraries and lantern-lit wards, we take with us a clearer sense of just how tangled medicine, morality, and humanity could be. In our next segment, we'll turn to the cultural memory of these time-show art, song, and literature reflected these strange beliefs, and how even centuries later, echoes of healing through pleasure found their way into the stories we still tell. As the centuries turned and the world slowly left behind the worst of the plague years, memories of that dark time did not vanish. They settled like dust in the crevices of culture. In paintings, plays, songs, and folk tales, the medieval experience of plague lived on, not always with accuracy, but with meaning. And nestled gently within these recollections was the faint, lingering notion that comfort, sometimes sensual, sometimes romantic, had once stood like a fragile bulwark against the tide of death. Take, for instance, the tavern songs of the late 14th and early 15th centuries. These verses, sung in low voices, over mugs of ale or goblets of warm wine, often mixed laughter with lament. One such ballad, recorded in the manuscript known as the Carmina Nova, includes a stanza that loosely translates, "If death shall come, let it find me, in the arms of she who laughs sweetly, for no physician's bitter brew can cure as well as love's bright dew." Though clearly metaphorical, the implication is simple. In the face of inevitable loss, warmth and affection offered a kind of solace, if not survival. Similarly, in illuminated manuscripts, we find small marginal illustrations, so-called drolleries, that hint at such beliefs. In the corner of a psalter from Burgundy, a tiny figure of a man appears to be fleeing from a skeletal figure, only to fall into the embrace of a curvaceous woman with flowing golden hair. The message, while playful, reflects a widespread truth. Art allowed people to express, in whimsical or coded ways, the strange intersection of desire and dread. More overt still are the theatrical works of later plague years. The morality plays of the 15th century often personified death, temptation, and virtue. In some, lust is portrayed not as a corrupting force, but as a character who attempts to soothe fear and despair through gentle song or dance. These were not endorsements of indulgence, but acknowledgements of human frailty, performed to audiences who had seen too much of both suffering and silence. In literature, too, we see echoes of this idea. The Decameron, mentioned earlier, is perhaps the most famous example of frame narrative in which a group of nobles escape the plague-ridden city and pass the time with storytelling, flirtation, and light-hearted games. Their tales, many of which explore themes of love and sensuality, are not simply entertainment, they are a form of resistance, a way to assert life in the presence of death. Even religious texts occasionally drift into this territory, albeit cautiously. Mystical writings from certain female monastics describe ecstatic experiences of divine love that blend spiritual and corporeal language. Though not sexual in intent, their descriptions of warmth, closeness, and surrender mirror, perhaps subconsciously, the same human needs that underpin the more earthly beliefs of the time. Visual art of the post-plague period, especially in the north, often grappled with mortality. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a common motif. In many versions, the living and the dead are shown holding hands, dancing together in a kind of final embrace. Among them, lovers, musicians, even bathers. The message, death comes for all, and no pleasure or class can prevent it. But still, the depiction is tender, almost resigned. A final waltz, not a flight. In later centuries, as medicine advanced and the plague receded into memory, these cultural traces faded, though never fully disappeared. Folk stories persisted in remote villages, where grandmothers whispered to grandchildren that a happy heart keeps the fever away, or that a kiss shared in the winter strengthens the blood. Whether rooted in plague years or simply old wisdom is hard to say, but the sentiment remains. Today, when we look back at these images and words, we are not just observing old beliefs, we are touching the soft imprint of lives lived in fear and in longing. The belief that sex, intimacy, or closeness could cure the plague may never have been widespread, but it found a place in the hearts of those who needed something to believe in, something tender, something human. As we prepare for our final segment, we turn our gaze to the present. How do we now interpret this peculiar chapter of history? What might it reveal not only about the past, but about our own moments of uncertainty, when comfort was scarce and closeness, perhaps, forbidden. As we emerge from the sepia-toned memories of the plague years and back into the soft hum of the present day, we are left with an odd and delicate question. Why did the idea that sex or even simple human closeness might cure the plague persist at all? And more intriguingly, why does it still whisper to us through the centuries? In truth, the belief was never truly about medicine. It was about meaning. In the face of an invisible enemy death without warning, illness without pattern, people sought something they could hold on to. The physical body, with all its sensations and frailties, became a source of comfort and defiance. To lie with another person, to feel the warmth of skin, the thrum of life beneath the surface, was to declare, if only to oneself, that life was still possible, that not all had been taken. During times of pestilence, the rules of propriety often loosened, then hardened again, like the breath before a storm. This rhythm, too, is something we recognize. In recent years, during our own modern plagues, whether viral, emotional, or otherwise, we saw similar behaviors. Isolation followed by an aching for connection, distance followed by the quiet seeking of nearness, not out of recklessness, but out of need. What history reveals is not that medieval people were strange or foolish for believing in sensual remedies, but that they were human, in ways we still are. Their knowledge was limited, yes, but their instincts were familiar. When the world closes in, when the air becomes suspect and the streets fall silent, we do not always turn first to reason. Sometimes, we turn to each other. Modern medicine, of course, has no place for the idea that sex can cure an airborne plague. But modern psychology tells us something adjacent, that closeness, intimacy, touch, these can bolster mental resilience, support immune response, and ease fear. The mechanisms may differ, but the effect is not entirely dissimilar. Warmth is still a kind of shield. Museums today hold the artifacts we've spoken of, the amulets, the charms, the manuscripts with their soft, curling script. Scholars debate their meaning, catalogue their origins, analyze their context. But something simpler lives in them too, a whisper of desperation, a blush of hope. They remind us that in every era, people have used what they had, and often, what they had was each other. In public health records and policy papers, the role of pleasure in crisis is rarely mentioned. Yet in literature, film, and personal memory, it returns. During long quarantines, how many found solace in shared beds, in fleeting contact, in simple gestures of affection? The behavior is old, its expression enduring. As we reflect gently on this strange footnote in the history of plague, we are left not with scandal or absurdity, but with a kind of quiet admiration. Even in their confusion, our ancestors reached for life. In their error, they displayed clarity. To be touched, this, they believed, might chase the shadow away, if only for a while, and perhaps that was enough. Now, let us slowly drift to the end of this journey. Our final thoughts will offer a gentle close, a return from the flickering lanterns of medieval alleys to the still, steady comfort of the present. And now, as we fold away the pages of this quiet chapter in history, let your breath ease, your shoulders soften, and your thoughts drift like the low curl of smoke from an old brass lantern. You have walked, gently, through the hushed corridors of plague-stricken towns, paused beside ink-stained desks of anxious physicians, and listened to the soft echoes of laughter and longing in forgotten chambers. You've seen how, even in the deepest shadow, people reached for warmth, sometimes foolishly, sometimes wisely, always humanly. The belief that sex or closeness might cure the plague was never widely taught, never formally upheld. It lived on the edges in soft whispers, in secret notes, in the warmth of hands held too long. And though it was wrong in medicine, it was not wrong in meaning. It showed a yearning for life, for connection, for the kind of comfort no tincture or tonic could offer. Today we are far from that world. Our air is filtered, our knowledge vast. We know how diseases move, how to treat, how to prevent. And yet, in quiet moments of uncertainty, we still turn toward one another. We still seek closeness. We still believe, perhaps not with our minds, but with our hearts, that being near to someone else can make things feel safer, better, softer. History is not always a record of great deeds and epic battles. Sometimes, it is the tracing of small hopes, of rituals repeated without reason, of tender mistakes made in the dark. And so, as you settle now into stillness, let the weight of centuries fade. Let the cobbled streets and shuttered rooms of the past fall quiet behind you. You are here in a time of comfort, in a bed of your own, with warmth that does not need to fight against plague winds. The past, with all its strange beliefs and desperate hopes, has whispered its story to you. Let it go now. Let your thoughts grow slow, and your breath steady. Sleep, now, in the knowledge that you are far from the fear that once moved men to seek cures not in vials or verses, but in closeness itself. Good night.